In the heart of downtown Chicago, a single moment changed two lives forever. When 7-year-old Keisha looked up at the well-dressed man and whispered those devastating words, she had no idea she was speaking to Marcus Williams, one of America's wealthiest black entrepreneurs. Marcus had built his empire from nothing, rising from the same streets where Keisha now stood hungry and alone. He'd forgotten what it felt like to wonder where your next meal would come from. But her innocent words cut through decades of success and reminded him of a promise he'd made long ago. Her simple confession would spark a chain reaction no one saw coming. What happens when unlimited resources meet unlimited need? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 62nd floor of the Willis Tower offered Marcus Williams a view that stretched beyond the horizon, past the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan to where the world seemed to dissolve into possibility. From his corner office, Chicago looked manageable, a grid of orderly streets and predictable patterns, nothing like the chaos he'd grown up in 30 floors below and 20 miles south. Marcus adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked his Patek Philippe watch. 3 o'clock meant the quarterly board meeting in 10 minutes, where they'd discuss the expansion into European markets. Numbers that would make most people dizzy with their zeros had become his daily vocabulary. The kind of money that built empires, bought politicians, and transformed entire industries. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who belonged in this rarefied air. Tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Shoes handcrafted in Milan. The carefully groomed appearance of someone who'd never known want, never felt the gnawing ache of an empty stomach or the shame of wearing the same clothes 3 days running. But appearances, Marcus knew better than most, could be masterfully deceptive. He opened the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, the one drawer that remained locked even from his executive assistant. Beneath, the quarterly reports and legal documents, his fingers found the small silver frame he kept hidden from view. The photograph inside was faded now, its edges worn from handling, but the image remained achingly clear. A boy of maybe 8 years old stared back at him. Skinny arms, clothes too big, and obviously second-hand, standing in front of a building that might generously be called an apartment if you ignored the broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. The boy's eyes held something Marcus had spent decades trying to forget, a hunger that went deeper than food, a longing for something better that felt impossible to reach. "Marcus, the board is ready for you." His assistant's voice through the intercom snapped him back to the present. Marcus quickly closed the drawer, his jaw tightening as he pushed the memories back where they belonged. The past was the past. He'd earned his way out of that life through intelligence, determination, and a ruthless focus on success that had carried him from the projects of South Chicago to the pinnacle of American business. The boardroom hummed with the quiet efficiency of power. 12 faces around a table that cost more than most families earned in a year, all looking to him for direction. These were his peers now, Harvard MBAs, inherited wealth, people who'd never wondered if the lights would stay on or if there'd be food for dinner. "Gentlemen, ladies." Marcus took his seat at the head of the table, his voice carrying the authority that came from building something from nothing. "European expansion is moving ahead of schedule. Our projections show." The numbers flowed from him with practiced ease. Revenue streams, market penetration, strategic partnerships, the language of wealth and growth that had become as natural as breathing. But even as he spoke, part of his mind wandered to that hidden photograph, to memories he'd thought he'd successfully buried. 23 years ago, Marcus Williams had been a different person entirely. Not the polished businessman commanding respect from titans of industry, but a kid named Mark who wore shoes with holes in the soles and learned to make mayonnaise sandwiches seem like a feast. His grandmother, the only stable presence in his chaotic childhood, had worked 3 jobs to keep him fed and clothed. her weathered hands always moving, cleaning office buildings at night, watching other people's children during the day, taking in ironing on weekends. "You're gonna be somebody special, baby," she used to tell him during those long nights when the heat got turned off or when the refrigerator held nothing but condiments and hope. "But when you get there, when you make it big, you remember where you came from. You remember the folks who ain't had your chances." She'd made him promise. Not just promise, swear on her Bible, looking her straight in the eyes, that he'd never forget the neighborhood that raised him, never turn his back on the people still struggling in the shadows of the city's gleaming towers. Marcus had meant it when he was 8, had meant it when he earned his scholarship to Northwestern, had meant it when he started his first tech company in a garage with nothing but a laptop and burning ambition. But success had a way of changing perspectives. First came the small compromises, moving to a better neighborhood, shopping at stores where the security guards didn't follow him around. Then bigger ones, joining exclusive clubs, dating women who'd never set foot in public housing, surrounding himself with people who shared his new reality rather than his old struggles. The promise became something he thought about less and less. His grandmother's death, 5 years ago, had severed one of the last remaining ties to that former life. He'd paid for a beautiful funeral, set up a small scholarship in her name, and told himself that was enough. That he'd honored her memory in the ways that mattered. "Marcus, your thoughts on the Chicago market analysis?" The board member's question pulled him back to the present discussion. Chicago, his city, though he rarely ventured beyond the loop. These days, the Chicago of his boardroom was a different place entirely from the Chicago of his childhood, a collection of demographic data and market opportunities, rather than neighborhoods where real people struggled with real problems. "Chicago remains our strongest domestic market," he said smoothly. "Consumer confidence is up 18%, and our demographic analysis shows significant growth potential in the 25 to 45 age bracket." Demographics, market segments, the comfortable language that turned human beings into data points that made it easier to forget that behind every number was someone like he used to be, someone who might be sitting in a car right now with their grandmother, wondering where their next meal would come from. The meeting ended with handshakes and satisfied nods. Another successful quarter, another step toward the kind of wealth that brought influence and security. Marcus returned to his office as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. He should have been reviewing the contracts waiting on his desk, should have been returning the dozen calls from investors and partners and politicians who wanted pieces of his time and attention. Instead, he found himself standing at the window, looking down at the ant-like figures moving through the streets below. Somewhere down there, in neighborhoods he hadn't visited in years, were the people he'd grown up with. The ones who hadn't found their way out, who were still fighting the same battles he'd fought as a child. Some had probably given up fighting altogether. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Dinner with the Hendersons at 8? The reservation at Alinea is confirmed. The Hendersons. Old money Chicago, the kind of couple who collected art and charity board positions with equal enthusiasm. Good people in their way, but their idea of understanding poverty was writing tax-deductible checks to organizations they'd never visited to help people they'd never met. Marcus typed back his confirmation, then returned to his locked drawer. The photograph seemed to stare at him with something that might have been accusation. That boy had dreams that went beyond personal success, had imagined using his future wealth to lift up everyone around him. When had those dreams become so small, so self-contained? A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Mr. Williams, your car is here for the dinner appointment." "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be right down." Marcus placed the photograph back in its hiding place and locked the drawer. Whatever that 8-year-old boy had promised his grandmother, whatever dreams he'd harbored about changing the world, belonged to a different life. He was Marcus Williams now, not the hungry kid from the South Side. He had responsibilities to his company, his investors, his own carefully constructed future. But as he rode the elevator down 62 floors to street level, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was descending toward something more than just the sidewalk, something that would demand he remember who he used to be, whether he wanted to or not. The city streets bustled with the usual evening crowd, office workers heading home, tourists snapping photos, the invisible population of people for whom the gleaming towers represented dreams rather than daily reality. Marcus's driver held the door of the black Mercedes, the leather interior cool and isolated from the chaos outside. As they pulled into traffic, Marcus caught a glimpse of a small figure huddled near the entrance to his building. A child, maybe. 7 or 8 years old, clutching what looked like a worn notebook. Something about the scene nagged at him, a recognition that went deeper than logic. "Driver, could you—" But the car had already turned the corner, carrying him toward his dinner appointment and away from whatever moment of connection might have been waiting on the sidewalk. He settled back into the leather seat, pushing the image from his mind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new ways to grow his empire. The past, and whatever obligations it might carry, would have to wait. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Chicago feel alive with possibility. Marcus emerged from his Mercedes at exactly 7:45 a.m., as he had every weekday for the past 3 years. The routine brought comfort, the familiar nod to the doorman, the predictable exchange of pleasantries about weather or sports, the smooth elevator ride to his kingdom in the clouds. But today, something was different. A small figure sat on the wide concrete steps leading to his building's entrance, partially hidden behind one of the ornate pillars. As Marcus approached, he could see it was a young girl, maybe 7 years old, with hair, and pulled back in neat braids, despite her obviously worn clothing. She clutched a tattered notebook against her chest like a shield. Most days, Marcus would have walked past without a second glance. Chicago's streets were full of people in difficult circumstances, and he'd long ago learned to insulate himself from their individual stories. But something about this child's posture, the way she sat with dignity despite her circumstances, the careful way she held that notebook, made him pause. "Excuse me," she said as he drew near, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir?" Marcus stopped, his hand on the brass door handle. Up close he could see that her clothes were clean but patched, her shoes too big for her feet. But her eyes, those eyes held an intelligence and depth that reminded him of someone he used to know. "Yes?" The girl looked down at her notebook, then back up at him, with the kind of courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. "I can't afford food." 4 words, simple, direct, devastating in their honesty. They hit Marcus like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and sending him careening back through decades to a time when he might have spoken those same words to a stranger on a street corner. "What did you say?" "I can't afford food," she repeated, louder this time, as if saying it again might somehow make the reality less terrible. "Me and my grandmama, we've been living in our car for 2 weeks now, and we used up the last of our money. Yesterday, Marcus felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. The carefully constructed barriers he'd built between his current life and his past began to crack. This child, this brave, desperate child, was holding up a mirror to everything he'd tried to forget. "What's your name?" "Keisha." She opened her notebook slightly, revealing pages covered in careful handwriting. "Keisha Johnson. And your grandmother?" "She's sleeping in the car. She doesn't know I came here." Keisha's voice dropped to a whisper. "She'd be mad if she knew I was asking strangers for help. She says we got our pride, even if we don't got nothing else." Pride. Marcus remembered that particular burden, the way it could keep you hungry rather than admit you needed help. His own grandmother had carried that same stubborn dignity, working herself into exhaustion rather than accept charity from anyone. "Keisha, what's in your notebook?" She hesitated, then opened it wider. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, stories, drawings, what looked like homework assignments, completed without any teacher to grade them. "I write stories," she said, "and I practice my math. Grandmama says education is the only thing nobody can take away from you." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. "Can I see?" Keisha handed him the notebook with the solemnity of someone sharing their most precious possession. The stories were remarkable, full of imagination and hope, despite being written in the margins of someone else's discarded homework. One page caught his attention. A story about a magical kingdom where all the hungry children got fed and all. The homeless families found warm places to sleep. "You wrote this?" She nodded. "I write a new story every day. Even when we don't have food, I can still make up stories about better places." The words hit him harder than any board presentation or financial report ever could. Here was a child maintaining hope in the face of circumstances that would have broken most adults, creating beauty from desperation, refusing to let her spirit be crushed by the weight of poverty. "Keisha, where is your car?" She pointed toward the parking garage across the street. "Over there, on the second level, the blue Toyota with the dent in the side." "Show me." They walked together across the busy street, Marcus's Italian leather shoes clicking against the concrete beside Keisha's worn sneakers. The parking garage smelled of oil and exhaust, but Marcus barely noticed. His attention was focused entirely on the small figure beside him, on the way she navigated this world with a competence born of necessity. The blue Toyota was exactly as she'd described. Dented, older than Keisha herself, with windows fogged from the breath of people sleeping. Inside, through the back window, Marcus could see an elderly woman curled up under a thin blanket, her grey hair visible above the fabric. "Grandmama doesn't like to ask for help," Keisha said again, as if reading his thoughts. "But I heard her crying last night when she thought I was asleep. She was praying for some kind of miracle." Marcus stared at the car, at this mobile home that sheltered 2 generations of his people, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. The photograph in his desk drawer suddenly seemed like more than just a reminder of where he'd come from. It felt like a responsibility he'd abandoned, a promise he'd broken, not just to his grandmother, but to every child like Keisha who still lived the life he'd escaped. "Wake her up," he said quietly. "Sir, wake up your grandmother. Tell her—" Marcus paused, trying to find words that would preserve her dignity while offering help she desperately needed. "Tell her that a friend would like to buy you both breakfast." Keisha's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" The next hour unfolded like something from one of Keisha's stories. Her grandmother, Dorothy Johnson, emerged from the car with the kind of grace that poverty couldn't touch. She was a small woman, probably in her 70s, with eyes that held the same intelligence as her granddaughter's, but tempered by decades of hardship. "I don't take charity," was the first thing she said to Marcus, her chin raised with the pride Keisha had warned him about. "It's not charity, ma'am. It's breakfast between neighbors." They went to a small diner 6 blocks away, the kind of place Marcus hadn't set foot in for years. Dorothy and Keisha ordered carefully, choosing the cheapest items on the menu despite Marcus's insistence that they get whatever they wanted. He watched them eat with the focused attention of people who weren't sure when their next meal might come, and felt ashamed of every casual dinner he'd taken for granted in recent memory. Over coffee that Dorothy savored like wine, the story came out in pieces. Dorothy had worked as a home health aide until her own health began failing. Medical bills had eaten through their savings. The apartment they'd called home for 15 years became unaffordable when Dorothy could no longer work full-time. The whipped car had become their refuge when the shelters filled up or became too dangerous. "Keisha's mama died when she was 3, Dorothy said, her weathered hand resting protectively on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Drugs took her, same as they took my son. But this baby here," she squeezed Keisha's shoulder, "this baby's gonna be different. She's smart as a whip and twice as determined." "I'm gonna be a writer," Keisha said around a mouthful of pancakes. "Or maybe a teacher, or maybe both." She writes in that notebook every single day, Dorothy continued. Even when we're hungry, even when we're scared, she writes her stories. Says they help her remember that things can get better. Marcus found himself thinking of his own 8-year-old self, the boy who dreamed of success not just for himself, but for everyone like him. They can get better, Keisha. They will get better. The promise slipped out before he could stop it, carrying more weight than he'd intended. Dorothy's eyes sharpened, studying his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people's intentions quickly and accurately. You seem like a kind man, she said carefully, but we don't need anyone feeling sorry for us. We just hit a rough patch, that's all. I don't feel sorry for you, Marcus said, and realized he meant it. What he felt was recognition, kinship, and something that might have been hope. I feel inspired by you. After breakfast, Marcus walked them back to their car. The morning rush hour was in full swing, and he was already late for his first meeting. But for the first time in years, the business world felt less important than the moment he was living. "Can I see you again?" he asked Keisha as she climbed into the back seat of the Toyota. She nodded eagerly. "We're usually here in the morning. The security guard doesn't bother us if we don't cause trouble. I'll see you tomorrow then." "Promise?" The word hit him like an echo from his past. "I promise." As Marcus walked back toward his building, he felt his phone buzzing with missed calls and urgent messages. His assistant would be frantic. The board would be wondering where he was. The carefully ordered routine of his successful life was already fragmenting. But instead of anxiety, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond profit margins and market share. Keisha's notebook had contained more than just stories. It had contained dreams that deserved to come true. And for the first time since his grandmother's death, Marcus remembered what it felt like to be responsible for someone else's hopes. He looked back once to see the blue Toyota pulling out of the parking garage, carrying two people whose lives had just intersected with his in ways none of them could yet understand. Tomorrow, he would keep his promise. But already he suspected that tomorrow would demand much more from him than just another breakfast. The lobby of his building felt different as he entered, more opulent, more removed from the reality most people lived. The elevator carried him up toward his office, but something fundamental had changed. The boy in the hidden photograph was no longer just a memory. He was a promise waiting to be kept. Marcus spent the rest of that first day trying to convince himself that the encounter with Keisha had been an anomaly, a momentary lapse in his otherwise disciplined focus. He attended his meetings, reviewed quarterly projections, and made the kind of strategic decisions that had built his empire. But concentration proved elusive. Every spreadsheet seemed to blur into images of a 7-year-old girl writing stories in a tattered notebook while living in a car. By evening, he'd given up pretending to work. Instead, he found himself researching homelessness statistics in Chicago, discovering numbers that should have horrified him, but somehow didn't surprise him. Families were the fastest-growing segment of the homeless population. Children made up nearly a quarter of all homeless individuals. The waiting lists for assistance programs stretched for months, sometimes years. He closed his laptop and stared out at the city lights, wondering how many of those glowing windows sheltered families like Dorothy and Keisha, and how many others had no windows at all. The next morning, Marcus arrived at his building 30 minutes early. Keisha was already there, sitting in the same spot with her notebook open across her knees. She looked up as he approached, her face breaking into a smile that made something tight in his chest loosen. "You came back. I promised I would." This time, their conversation lasted longer. Marcus learned that Keisha had been reading to her grandmother from library books, that Dorothy had been a teacher herself before life circumstances forced her into home health care, that they'd been moving their car every few nights to avoid being hassled by police or building security. "Grandmama's been coughing a lot lately," Keisha confided. "She tries to hide it, but I hear her at night. She says it's just a cold, but colds don't last this long, do they?" the concern in her young voice stirred something protective in Marcus. "Has she seen a doctor?" Keisha shook her head. "We can't afford doctors. She says it'll get better on its own." After their breakfast together, this time at a slightly better restaurant where Dorothy seemed more comfortable, Marcus found himself unable to focus on work again. During his lunch break, he did something he hadn't done in years. He drove through the neighborhoods where he'd grown up. The South Side looked both familiar and foreign. Some blocks showed signs of improvement, new community centers, renovated housing, small businesses that hadn't been there in his youth. But others appeared frozen in decline, marked by empty, lots where buildings used to stand, by the kind of institutional neglect that made hope feel like a luxury few could afford. He found himself thinking about Dorothy's cough, about the way Keisha tried to act older than her years, about the dignity they both maintained despite circumstances that would have broken lesser people. These weren't just statistics or charity cases. They were his people, connected to him by shared history and common struggle. That afternoon, Marcus made his first attempt at direct intervention. He called Dorothy's cell phone number, which Keisha had reluctantly provided. "Mrs. Johnson, this is Marcus Williams. I had breakfast with you and Keisha yesterday." "Yes, I remember." Dorothy's voice carried a note of wariness. "What can I do for you? I was wondering if I could help with some immediate needs. Perhaps contribute to a security deposit on an apartment or—" "Mr. Williams." Dorothy's interruption was gentle but firm. "I told you yesterday we don't take charity." "It wouldn't be charity. It would be charity. And the answer is no. Keisha and I will figure this out ourselves." The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, frustrated by Dorothy's pride even as he understood it. His own grandmother had possessed the same fierce independence, the same reluctance to accept help that might come with strings attached or judgment. He tried a different approach. Through his assistant, he contacted several social service agencies, thinking he might fund emergency assistance programs or expedite the Johnsons' placement in temporary housing. What he discovered was a maze of bureaucracy that would have challenged someone with his resources and education. For someone like Dorothy, it must have felt impossible. The waiting list for emergency housing assistance is currently 18 months, one social worker told him, and that's for families with children who meet very specific criteria. What about medical care? The free clinic has a 3-week waiting list for non-emergency appointments. Emergency rooms are required to provide care regardless of ability to pay, but that creates a billing situation that many people want to avoid. Marcus hung up feeling overwhelmed by the systemic barriers that seemed designed to perpetuate rather than solve the problems they claimed to address. No wonder Dorothy's pride had evolved as a defense mechanism. The system seemed to offer help with one hand while humiliating people with the other. Over the next several days, Marcus continued meeting Keisha for breakfast, each conversation, deepening his understanding of their situation and his frustration with his inability to help effectively. Dorothy remained politely distant, accepting meals, but deflecting any attempts at broader assistance. It was Friday morning when Keisha appeared with red-rimmed eyes and a piece of paper clutched in her small fist. "What's wrong?" She handed him the paper without speaking. It was a notice, official-looking and harsh in its bureaucratic language. Final notice, unpaid medical services. Account holder, Dorothy Mae Johnson. Amount due, 8/2/47 collection agency. Assignment pending wage garnishment authorized by court order. Marcus read the notice twice, his anger building with each line. $8,000, less than he spent on suits in a year, was threatening to destroy what remained of Dorothy's financial stability. The medical services listed were for treatment of pneumonia 6 months earlier, emergency room visits, chest x-rays, medications that had probably saved her life. "She doesn't know I took this from her purse," Keisha whispered, "but I heard her talking to someone on the phone. They're gonna take money from her social security check. She was crying." Marcus folded the notice carefully, his mind already calculating. $8,000 was nothing to him, less than he'd spent on wine at his last business dinner. But the system had turned it into an impossible burden for a woman already struggling to survive. "Keisha, does your grandmother have any other debts like this?" She nodded miserably. "There's a whole folder of them in the car. Bills from when she had to go to the hospital last year, and doctor visits and medicines. She keeps them in an old envelope and looks at them sometimes when she thinks I'm not watching." That afternoon, Marcus cancelled his remaining meetings and drove to the parking garage where he knew he'd find the blue Toyota. Dorothy was sitting in the driver's seat, reading a book she'd probably borrowed from the library. When she saw him approaching, her expression grew wary. "Mr. Williams, Keisha's not here. She's at the library, doing her homework." "I know. I wanted to talk to you." "About what?" Marcus held up the crumpled notice. Dorothy's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "She had no right to take that. She's worried about you. We both are." "I don't need your worry, and I certainly don't need your pity." Dorothy's voice shook slightly, but her spine remained straight. "That's my business to handle." "Mrs. Johnson, Dorothy, you're trying to handle a system that's designed to defeat people like us." "People like us?" Her eyebrows rose. "Mr. Williams, I don't know what you do for work, but those clothes and that car suggest you haven't been people like us for a very long time." The observation stung, because it was true. "You're right. I haven't been where you are for many years, but I remember what it felt like. And I remember someone who used to tell me that accepting help from family wasn't charity, it was community. We're not family, aren't we?" The question hung between them in the stale air of the parking garage. Dorothy studied his face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people's motives, quickly and accurately. "What do you want from us, Mr. Williams?" It was the first time she'd asked the question directly, and Marcus realized he didn't have a simple answer. What did he want? To assuage his guilt, to recapture some connection to his past, to prove to himself that success hadn't completely corrupted his soul. "I want Keisha to keep writing her stories," he said finally. "I want you to see a doctor. About that cough. I want you both to have a place to sleep where you don't have to worry about being moved along by security guards. And what do you get out of it?" Marcus thought about the photograph in his desk drawer, about promises made to a dying grandmother, about the 8-year-old boy who dreamed of lifting up everyone around him. "Maybe I get to remember who I used to be." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Finally, she spoke. "That medical debt, it's not the only one. I know, and even if someone paid it off, there'd be more. My health isn't getting any better, and medicines cost money I don't have. We'll figure it out. We, community," Marcus said. "Like my grandmother used to say." Dorothy's smile was small but genuine. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." She was, and she would have liked you. It was a small breakthrough, but Marcus felt its significance as he walked back to his office building. The boy in the photograph had taken his first real step back into the world, and there would be no retreating now. But as his phone buzzed with increasingly urgent messages from business partners wondering about his recent distractions, Marcus realized that remembering who he used to be might require choosing between who he'd become and who he wanted to be. The choice was coming faster than he'd expected. The following Saturday morning found Marcus in his Mercedes, driving through neighborhoods he hadn't seen in over a decade. Dorothy had finally agreed to let him help with the medical bills, but only after making him promise to understand the full scope of what he was getting involved in. "If you're going to be part of this community," she'd said, "you need to see the community." Keisha sat in the passenger seat, her ever-present notebook in her lap, serving as his guide through streets that should have been familiar but felt foreign. The city Marcus knew from his penthouse view was all gleaming towers and orderly progress. This Chicago was different, a patchwork of survival and resilience where beauty and decay existed side by side. "Turn left here," Keisha directed, pointing toward a street lined with weathered brick buildings. This is where me and Grandmama used to live, before we had to move to the car. The apartment building stood 3 stories tall, its facade marked by time and limited maintenance, but still possessing an underlying dignity. Children played on the sidewalk while adults sat on stoops, creating the kind of community Marcus remembered from his own childhood. What struck him wasn't the poverty, he'd expected that, but the normalcy. People going about their lives, creating joy and connection, despite circumstances that would have overwhelmed many. Mrs. Martinez lives on the 2nd floor, Keisha continued, her voice taking on the tour guide quality of someone proud of her neighborhood despite its challenges. She watches kids after school when their parents are working. And Mr. Thompson, in 3B, fixes cars in the alley behind the building. He taught me how to check oil levels. Marcus parked and followed Keisha up the front steps, conscious of how his designer clothes marked him as an outsider. The lobby smelled of cleaning products and cooking spices, with a bulletin board covered in handwritten notices: babysitting, services, cars for sale, apartments for rent at prices that seemed impossibly low to him, but were apparently still out of reach for many. Keisha, baby. An elderly Latina woman emerged from apartment 2A, her face lighting up at the sight of his young guide. "Where you been, sweetheart? I've been worried about you and your grandmama." "We're staying with a friend," Keisha said diplomatically. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Mr. Marcus. He's been helping us out." Mrs. Martinez studied Marcus with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Not his expensive watch, his perfectly groomed appearance, or the way he stood slightly apart as if unsure of his welcome. "Help is good," she said finally. "We all need help sometimes." Over the next hour, Marcus met a dozen residents of the building, each with their own story of struggle and perseverance. Single mothers working multiple jobs to keep their families housed, elderly residents on fixed incomes choosing between medication and groceries, young men and women with college degrees driving for rideshare companies because the jobs they'd trained for had vanished or moved elsewhere. What amazed Marcus wasn't the hardship. He'd lived hardship himself, but the intricate network of mutual support that had developed. Mrs. Martinez watched children for parents who couldn't afford childcare. Mr. Thompson fixed cars for neighbors who paid him in home-cooked meals or help with his own rent. Ms. Washington on the 3rd floor tutored kids whose schools didn't have resources for individual attention. "It's like a whole economy running on kindness," Marcus murmured to Keisha as they walked back to his car. "Grandmama says that's how communities survive," she replied. "When the system doesn't work for people, people have to work for each other." Their next stop was the Garfield Community Center, a converted school building that served as the neighborhood's hub for services ranging from job training to food distribution. Keisha pushed through the heavy glass doors with the confidence of someone who belonged, while Marcus followed more hesitantly. The main hallway buzzed with activity. Adults clustered around tables filling out forms. Children ran between classrooms where volunteers led educational programs. And the smell of cooking food suggested a meal program in operation. A large bulletin board dominated one wall, covered with job listings, housing opportunities, and volunteer sign-up sheets. "Can I help you?" A young black woman approached them, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. "I'm Denise Crawford, the program coordinator. I'm Marcus Williams, and this is Keisha Johnson. I was hoping to learn about volunteer opportunities." Denise's eyebrows rose slightly. Marcus suspected his appearance wasn't typical of their usual volunteers, but her smile remained welcoming. "We always need volunteers. What kind of skills do you have?" The question caught Marcus off guard. His skills were corporate: strategic planning, financial analysis, deal negotiation, none of which seemed immediately relevant to the community center's mission. "I'm in business," he said vaguely. "Technology, mostly." "Great. We need help with our computer lab. Half the machines are broken, and the software is about 10 years out of date." Denise gestured toward a room where outdated desktop computers sat on folding tables. A lot of our clients are trying to apply for jobs online, but they don't have reliable internet access or computer skills. Marcus surveyed the computer lab with growing dismay. The equipment was indeed ancient by tech standards, running operating systems he hadn't seen in years. The internet connection appeared to be shared across dozens of machines, creating speeds that would have tested anyone's patience. This is what people are supposed to use for job applications. When it works, Denise confirmed, which isn't always. Last week we had 3 people lose applications because the system crashed. What about the literacy program? Keisha interjected. Mr. Marcus, you should see the literacy program. That's where I go when Grandmama has appointments. Denise led them to a room where volunteers worked one-on-one with adults who were learning to read or improving their English skills. Marcus watched a middle-aged man carefully sound out words from a children's book, his concentration absolute. At another table, a young mother practiced filling out job applications while her toddler played quietly nearby. We have about 50, and people on the waiting list for tutoring, Denise explained. Many of our clients missed educational opportunities when they were younger, or they're immigrants trying to improve their English. But we only have enough volunteers to serve about half the people who need help. As they continued the tour, Marcus felt increasingly overwhelmed by the scope of need. The food pantry served over 200 families monthly, but never had enough donations to meet demand. The child care program had space for 15 children, but requests from 40 families. The job training courses had modern curriculum, but outdated equipment. How do you decide who gets help and who doesn't? Marcus asked. We don't, Denise replied. Simply, we help everyone we can, and we keep trying to find resources for the ones we can't. When they returned to the main hallway, Marcus found himself staring at the volunteer sign-up sheet. Names were scrawled in various handwriting styles: teachers, retirees, college students, community members giving back as they could. At the bottom, someone had written, computer repair and tech support. Urgent need. I'd like to sign up, Marcus said, reaching for the pen. For what specifically? Marcus thought about his penthouse office, his state-of-the-art equipment, his budget for technology that exceeded the community center's entire annual funding. Everything, whatever you need. Denise studied him with the same assessing look Mrs. Martinez had given him earlier. Mr. Williams, can I ask what brought you here? Keisha, he said simply, glancing down at the girl who had somehow become his guide back to a world he'd almost forgotten. She reminded me that helping isn't just about writing checks. No offense, but you look like someone who's used to writing pretty big checks. Marcus smiled at her directness. I am, but Keisha's grandmother is teaching me that money without understanding isn't really help. It's just another way of keeping distance. And what do you understand now? Marcus looked around the community center, at the parents juggling work and education, the volunteers giving their time to neighbors they might never see again, the children like Keisha who maintained hope despite circumstances that would have defeated many adults. I understand that I've been solving the wrong problems, he said. I've been focused on building wealth instead of building community. And I understand that fixing this, he gestured toward the broken computers, the overcrowded programs, the waiting lists that represented people in need, requires more than money. It requires showing up. Denise handed him the pen. Then welcome to the community, Mr. Williams. Fair warning, once you start showing up, it's hard to stop. As Marcus signed his name to the volunteer sheet, he felt Keisha's small hand slip into his. Grandmama's gonna be proud of you, she said quietly. Why's that? Because you're keeping your promise. What promise? The one you made when you were little, Keisha replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood. Grandmama says everyone makes promises when they're kids about how they're going to change the world. Most grown-ups forget those promises, but you're remembering. Walking back to his car, Marcus realized that Keisha was right. Somewhere along the path from that hungry 8-year-old to the successful businessman, he'd convinced himself that individual achievement was enough. That escaping poverty meant he'd done his part, but community wasn't about escaping. It was about returning with the tools to lift others up alongside you. The sign-up sheet in his pocket felt heavier than any contract he'd ever signed. And for the first time in years, that weight felt like responsibility rather than burden. His phone buzzed with weekend messages from business associates, investment opportunities that couldn't wait until Monday, social events that suddenly seemed less important than they had a week ago. Marcus looked down at Keisha, still clutching her notebook full of stories about better worlds. "What are you writing about today?" he asked. "A man who forgot he was magic," she said without hesitation. "But then he remembered, and he used his magic to help everyone in his neighborhood." "How does the story end?" Keisha smiled up at him. "I don't know, yet I'm still writing it." As they drove back through the neighborhoods Marcus was slowly remembering, he realized that Keisha's story might be writing him as much as he was helping to write it. And for the first time since his grandmother's death, he felt excited to see how it would end. The conference room on the 60th floor had hosted hundreds of presentations over the years, but Marcus couldn't remember ever feeling more nervous as he stood before his board of directors with his laptop open and a folder of research balanced on the mahogany table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago stretched toward the horizon, indifferent to the conversation that was about to reshape his relationship with everything he'd built. "Gentlemen, ladies," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart, "I want to present a proposal that represents a new direction for Williams Technologies. One that aligns our corporate resources with community development in a way that's both profitable and transformative." The 12 faces around the table showed polite attention, mixed with the kind of skepticism that came from years of experience with ambitious proposals that promised to revolutionize everything. These were people who'd made fortunes by focusing on core competencies and proven markets, not by chasing social causes that might or might not generate returns. "Our community investment initiative," Marcus continued, clicking to his first slide, "would establish Williams Technologies as a leader in what I call proximity economics, using our technological expertise to create sustainable economic development in underserved communities within Chicago." The presentation that followed was the most thoroughly researched project Marcus had ever undertaken. He'd spent 3 weeks analyzing community needs, studying successful corporate social responsibility programs, and developing financial models that showed how strategic investment in education, technology access, and small business development could generate both social impact and long-term returns. The initial investment would be $12 million over 3 years, he explained, watching faces around the table grow increasingly skeptical. $6 million for technology infrastructure, computer labs, high-speed internet access, digital literacy programs, $4 million for small business microloans and entrepreneurship training, $2 million for educational partnerships with local schools. Board member Patricia Chen, a venture capitalist who joined the board 2 years earlier, was the first to speak. "Marcus, these are admirable goals, but I have to question whether this represents the best use of shareholder resources. Our fiduciary responsibility is to maximize returns, not to subsidize social programs. The returns are built into the model," Marcus replied, clicking to his financial projections. "Conservative estimates show that technology education programs alone could generate over 300 new job candidates with relevant skills within 5 years. Small business development could create supplier relationships and expand our customer base in emerging markets." James Morrison, the board's longest-serving member and Marcus's early mentor, leaned forward with the expression of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news. "Marcus, may I ask what prompted this particular initiative?" It was the question Marcus had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. How could he explain that his motivation came from a 7-year-old girl living in a car, that his understanding of community need had been shaped by volunteering at a community center rather than market research, that the driving force behind this proposal was a promise made to a dying grandmother decades ago. "I've been conducting field research in underserved communities," he said carefully. "The data shows significant untapped potential that could be developed through strategic investment." Field research. Morrison's tone suggested he found the term curious. Through what organization? Direct community engagement. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken questions. Marcus could see his board members exchanging glances, reading between the lines of his careful responses and reaching conclusions he wasn't prepared to discuss. Robert Sterling, the board's financial hawk, was characteristically blunt. "Marcus, this sounds like charity dressed up as business strategy. If you want to make charitable contributions, there are tax-efficient ways to do that without compromising the company's focus. This isn't charity." "Then what's the timeline? For profitability?" Sterling interrupted. "When do we see returns that justify $12 million in investment?" Marcus felt the presentation slipping away from him. The financial models he'd spent weeks perfecting suddenly seemed inadequate to convey what he'd learned in the past month. How could spreadsheets capture the innovation he'd seen in people making miracles happen with no resources? How could profit projections reflect the economic potential of communities that had been systematically disinvested in for decades? "The timeline for direct financial returns is 3 to 5 years, he admitted, "but the community impact begins immediately, and the long-term benefits, 3 to 5 years. Jen's voice carried a note of disbelief. "For $12 million in a speculative community development program. Marcus, I have to ask, is this really the best use of our resources, or are you pursuing a personal agenda?" The question hit like a physical blow. Marcus looked around the table at faces that had once shown him nothing but respect and support. These were people who'd believed in him, who'd backed his vision when he was building the company from nothing. Now they were looking at him with the kind of concern usually reserved for colleagues who'd begun making questionable decisions. "My agenda," Marcus said slowly, "is to build sustainable value for this company and the communities we operate in. By investing in programs with no proven track record and questionable returns," Morrison added sadly. "Marcus, we've known each other for 15 years. This doesn't sound like the strategic thinking that built this company." The meeting that followed was painful in its civility. His board members weren't hostile. They were disappointed. They asked probing questions about his research methodology, his assessment of risk factors, his analysis of alternative investments that might yield better returns. Each question revealed how far apart he'd grown from the people who'd once shared his vision. When the formal vote came, it wasn't even close. 11 votes against, 1 in favor. The Community Investment Initiative was rejected by the widest margin in the company's history. "Marcus," Morrison said as the others filed out, "I hope you'll take some time to reconsider your priorities. The company needs leadership that's focused on our core mission, not distracted by—" He paused, searching for diplomatic language. "External concerns." Sitting alone in the conference room afterward, Marcus stared at his presentation materials, the carefully crafted slides, the detailed financial projections, the folder full of research that had convinced no one. In the margin of his notes, he'd written "promise to grandmother" and then crossed it out, realizing how inadequate it sounded as a business justification. His phone buzzed with a text from Keisha. "Grandmama had to go to emergency room. Can you come?" Marcus was out of the building and in his car within minutes, his rejected presentation forgotten in the face of more immediate concerns. He found Dorothy and Keisha in the waiting area of Chicago General Hospital, Dorothy looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. "What happened?" "She couldn't stop coughing," Keisha said, her young face tight with worry. "And she was having trouble breathing. The ambulance people said her lungs might have infection again." Dorothy reached for Marcus's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her obvious weakness. "I'm sorry to bother you with this," she whispered. "I know you've got important business to tend to." "You are my important business," Marcus replied, the words carrying more truth than any presentation he'd given that day. The next few hours unfolded in the familiar rhythm of hospital waiting, brief conversations with nurses, periodic updates from doctors, the gradual accumulation of information that painted a picture of Dorothy's declining health. Pneumonia had returned, complicated by underlying respiratory issues that had gone untreated for too long. "She'll need to stay for several days," Dr. Patel explained during a brief consultation. "The infection is serious, and she'll require IV antibiotics and monitoring." "What about insurance?" Dr. Patel's expression grew carefully neutral. "We'll work with the billing department to develop a payment plan." Marcus knew what that meant. Another crushing medical debt that would follow Dorothy for years, another impossible choice between health and financial survival. The kind of systemic trap his rejected presentation had been designed to address. While Dorothy slept and Keisha dozed in the uncomfortable waiting room chair, Marcus made phone calls. He contacted his personal attorney, his financial advisor, and a private medical billing company that specialized in negotiating hospital costs. By morning, Dorothy's current and future medical expenses would be covered through a trust fund that preserved her dignity while ensuring she received the care she needed. When Dorothy woke up, Marcus was sitting beside her bed, his expensive suit rumpled from spending the night in a hospital chair. "You didn't have to stay," she said softly. "Yes, I did. What about your business meetings?" Marcus thought about the presentation that had failed so completely, about board members who questioned his judgment, about the growing distance between his corporate success and his personal values. "My business will have to adapt," he said. "I'm learning that some things are more important than quarterly projections." Dorothy studied his face with the penetrating gaze that missed nothing. "That fancy presentation didn't go well, did it?" Marcus started, surprised that she'd guessed. "How did you know about that?" "Keisha told me you were working on something special, some way to help the whole community, instead of just us. And you've got that look people get when they've been told their dreams don't make financial sense. The board rejected it, unanimously, except for my own vote. But you're not giving up." "No," Marcus realized as he said it. "I'm not giving up." "Good," Dorothy said with a small smile. "Because Keisha's got a new story she's writing about you. Something about a man who had to choose between two kinds of wealth. I think she's curious to see how it ends." Looking out the hospital window at the city beyond, Marcus realized that Dorothy was right. He was in the middle of choosing between two kinds of wealth, the kind measured in profit margins and stock prices, and the kind measured in lives changed and communities lifted up. His phone was already buzzing with messages from concerned board members, from investors who'd heard about the failed presentation, from business partners wondering if he'd lost his strategic focus. Marcus turned off his phone and settled back in the uncomfortable hospital chair. His choice was becoming clearer, even if the consequences were still unfolding. The boy in the hidden photograph had waited long enough to keep his promise. 2 weeks after Dorothy's hospitalization, Marcus had developed a routine that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. Mornings began with coffee and strategy sessions in hospital rooms or community center meeting spaces instead of corporate boardrooms. Afternoons were spent split between managing his increasingly restless business empire and learning the intricate details of lives lived on society's margins. The manila folder on his home office desk had grown thick with receipts that told stories no financial report could capture. Anonymous payments to electricity companies, preventing shutoffs, grocery store gift cards distributed through the community center, security deposits for families moving from cars to apartments, medical bills quietly settled through intermediary, services that preserved recipients' dignity. Marcus had become a ghost in his own city, moving through neighborhoods his business associates never visited, solving problems they didn't know existed. The amounts were small by his standards, $50 here, $200 there, but the cumulative impact was transformative in ways that defied traditional accounting. Mrs. Martinez had been able to keep her childcare program running when anonymous donors covered the cost of liability insurance she couldn't afford. Mr. Thompson's informal auto repair service had expanded when someone mysteriously paid for professional tools and a proper workspace. 3 families from Keisha's former apartment building had found stable housing when their security deposits appeared without explanation. The most significant change involved Keisha herself. Through a combination of scholarship programs, private tutoring arrangements, and what appeared to be bureaucratic miracles, she'd been enrolled at Lincoln Elementary, a school with resources that matched her academic potential rather than her economic circumstances. "I learned about photosynthesis today," she announced during one of their weekly dinners, her notebook now supplemented by proper textbooks and art supplies. "Did you know plants can make their own food from sunlight? Mrs. Rodriguez says I might want to be a scientist when I grow up, not just a writer." "You could be both," Marcus suggested. "Science fiction writers need to understand science." Could I really? The question carried the weight of possibilities that had seemed impossible. Just weeks earlier, Marcus watched her eyes light up with dreams that now had pathways to achievement, and felt something shift in his understanding of what success actually meant. Dorothy, recovering slowly but steadily in the comfortable apartment Marcus had arranged, noticed the change in her granddaughter immediately. "She's asking different questions," she told Marcus during one of his daily visits. "Not just what-if questions anymore, but how-do-I questions." That's the difference between dreaming and planning. The community center had become Marcus's second office, where he spent late afternoons helping with the computer lab he'd quietly upgraded and early evenings learning about the complex web of policies that kept families trapped in cycles of poverty. Denise Crawford had become both teacher and confessor, patiently explaining how voucher program, she said one evening as they reviewed applications from families seeking assistance. "The wait list is 3 years long, and when people finally get vouchers, they can't find landlords who'll accept them. So they stay in situations that aren't safe or healthy because the alternative is homelessness. Why don't landlords accept the vouchers? Discrimination mostly, though they call it business decisions. Plus the paperwork is complicated, and the housing authority inspections can be delayed for months. Landlords would rather rent to people who can pay immediately without bureaucratic complications." Marcus studied the applications spread across the table, each one representing a family's hope for stability, each one facing obstacles that had nothing to do with worthiness or effort. What if someone guaranteed the rent payments and handled the paperwork? That would help, but it would also be expensive. We're talking about dozens of families, and median rent for a decent 2-bedroom apartment is about $1,500 a month. The mathematics were simple enough, maybe $18,000 per family per year, multiplied by the 50 families currently on waiting lists. Less than $1 million total, which was pocket change compared to his failed $12 million corporate proposal. But this would be personal money, not corporate resources, and it would represent a level of commitment that went far beyond charitable donations. Marcus's business partners had begun expressing concerns about his availability and focus. Conference goals were rescheduled around community meetings. Deal negotiations were interrupted by calls from schools or social workers. The careful boundaries between his professional and personal lives had dissolved entirely. "Marcus, we need to talk." James Morrison's voice carried the weight of difficult conversations when he called on a Thursday afternoon. "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" The meeting that followed was tense with unspoken ultimatums. Morrison, along with 2 other senior partners, sat across from Marcus in a conference room that suddenly felt smaller and more oppressive than usual. There are rumors, Morrison began carefully, about your recent activities, stories about anonymous donations, community involvement, spending significant time in, he paused, searching for diplomatic language, in unconventional locations for someone in your position. I'm not sure what you're asking me. I'm asking if these rumors are true. And if they are, I'm asking whether they represent sound judgment for someone responsible for a $250 million enterprise. Marcus felt the familiar weight of divided loyalties. These men had been his allies, his mentors, his partners in building something that had exceeded all their original dreams. They deserved honesty, but he wasn't sure they were capable of understanding his truth. I'm involved in community development work, he said carefully. It's personal, but it's also strategic. Understanding underserved markets. Marcus. Morrison's interruption was gentle but firm. This isn't about market research, and we all know it. Patricia Chen spoke with someone at Chicago General Hospital who mentioned your involvement in paying for a patient's medical expenses. Robert Sterling heard you've been volunteering at a community center. These aren't strategic business activities. They're personal charitable work. And if they are, then we need to discuss whether your personal interests are compromising your professional judgment. The threat was implicit but clear. Marcus could feel his carefully constructed world threatening to fracture along lines he'd hoped to keep separate. His business success had given him the resources to help people like Dorothy and Keisha, but that same business now demanded loyalty that conflicted with his growing community commitments. That evening, Marcus found himself back at the community center, helping Keisha with homework that was more challenging than anything she'd encountered in her previous school. Her progress was remarkable. Reading levels that had jumped 2 grades in 6 weeks, mathematical concepts she grasped with startling speed, creative writing that showed increasing sophistication and emotional depth. Mr. Marcus, she said, looking up from a science textbook, Mrs. Rodriguez says, I could maybe get into college someday. Is that really possible? It's more than possible, Marcus replied. It's probable, but what about the money? College costs a lot, doesn't it? The question reminded Marcus of his own scholarship anxieties decades earlier, the terror that financial limitations would cut short academic dreams just when they seemed within reach. He'd made it through with scholarships, work-study programs, and the kind of determination that came from having no alternative options. There are ways to pay for college, he said. Scholarships, grants, programs for students like you who've shown exceptional potential. Students like me? Smart students, determined students, students who've overcome challenges that would have stopped other people. Keisha returned to her homework with renewed focus, but Marcus found himself thinking about the broader implications of her question. How many other children in this community possess similar potential that would never be discovered or developed? How many families were trapped by systems that seemed designed to perpetuate inequality rather than create opportunity? His phone buzzed with messages from business associates, each one a reminder of the professional relationships that were growing strained by his divided attention. Investors wanted reassurance about the company's direction. Partners needed decisions on time-sensitive deals. Board members expected explanations for his changed priorities. As Marcus helped Keisha pack up her books, he realized that his 2 worlds had become incompatible in ways that no amount of careful scheduling could resolve. The community center needed someone who could show up consistently, who understood that crisis didn't operate on business hours. His corporation demanded someone whose primary loyalty was to profit margins and shareholder value. Mr. Marcus? Keisha's voice interrupted his brooding. Are you okay? You look sad. I'm not sad, Marcus said, though he wasn't sure that was true. I'm thinking about what? About choices, and about what happens when you can't have everything you want. Keisha studied his face with the seriousness that had first caught his attention weeks earlier. Grandmama says when grown-ups talk about not being able to have everything they want, They usually mean they have to choose between what they want for themselves and what they want for other people. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. What does your grandmother say about how to make that choice? She says you ask yourself what you'll be proud of when you're old and looking back. And then you do that thing, even if it's scary. Walking to his car through streets that had become familiar again, Marcus thought about Keisha's wisdom and Dorothy's advice. The manila folder of anonymous receipts represented more than charitable giving. It represented a choice between two versions of himself. The successful businessman who had escaped poverty through individual achievement, or the community member who used that success to lift others up alongside him. His phone rang with a call from Morrison, probably wanting answers about tomorrow's priorities and next quarter's projections. Marcus let it go to voicemail. Some conversations could wait until he figured out which version of himself would be answering them. The call came at 5:47 a.m., jarring Marcus from the first solid sleep he'd managed in weeks. His phone display showed Morrison's number, and the early hour suggested the kind of crisis that couldn't wait for business hours. "Marcus, we have a problem, a big one." "What kind of problem?" "Have you seen this morning's Tribune?" Marcus was already moving toward his laptop, a sense of dread building in his chest. "No, what?" "Page 1, above the fold. You need to see this immediately." The Tribune's website loaded with agonizing slowness, and then Marcus found himself staring at a headline that made his blood run cold. "Tech mogul's charity questioned, is Marcus Williams exploiting poverty for public relations?" Below the headline was a photograph he recognized immediately. Keisha and Dorothy sitting in the diner where they'd shared their first meal together, taken from a distance that suggested surveillance rather than documentation. The image had been cropped to emphasize their worn clothing and humble surroundings, while Marcus appeared only as a shadowy figure in the background. The article, bylined by investigative reporter Janet Torres, was devastating in its implications. For the past 2 months, Williams Technologies CEO Marcus Williams has been photographed repeatedly with 7-year-old Keisha Johnson, a homeless child living in a car with her elderly grandmother. Sources close to Williams' company suggest these highly publicized encounters are part of a calculated public relations campaign designed to rehabilitate his image, following failed attempts to convince his board of directors to approve questionable community investment initiatives. Marcus's hands trembled as he continued reading. Financial records obtained through sources familiar with Williams's recent activities show patterns of anonymous donations and payments that appear designed to create compelling human interest stories rather than address systemic poverty. Critics question whether Williams is genuinely helping the Johnson family or exploiting their circumstances for personal gain. The article went on to detail his recent community involvement with an accuracy that suggested inside information. His volunteer work at the community center was reframed as orchestrated photo opportunities. His assistance with Dorothy's medical bills became evidence of strategic, charitable giving designed to generate media coverage. Even his presence at Lincoln Elementary during Keisha's school visits was described as inserting himself into educational settings for maximum public relations impact. Most damaging were the anonymous quotes from sources described as Williams Technologies insiders. Marcus has become increasingly distracted by these publicity stunts while neglecting his actual business responsibilities. His board is concerned about his judgment and his ability to lead the company effectively. The timing is suspicious. Just weeks after his community investment proposal was rejected by the board, he suddenly develops this very public relationship with a photogenic homeless family. It's hard not to see this as an attempt to pressure his colleagues through media. Manipulation. Marcus's phone rang again. Morrison, probably wondering if he'd seen the article yet. He let it go to voicemail and continued reading, feeling sick as Torres systematically deconstructed every genuine moment he'd shared with Keisha and Dorothy. The article concluded with speculation about Williams Technology's future leadership and Marcus's suitability for his role as CEO, suggesting that his erratic behavior and questionable judgment had created concerns among investors and board members. But it was the final paragraph that hit Marcus like a physical blow. Efforts to reach the Johnson family for comment were unsuccessful. However, sources suggest they have become increasingly uncomfortable with the media attention surrounding their situation and are considering distancing themselves from Williams to protect their privacy. Marcus immediately called Dorothy's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. He tried the community center, where Denise answered on the first ring. "Marcus? Thank God you called. Have you seen—" "I've seen it. Where are Dorothy and Keisha?" "They're here, but Marcus, there are reporters outside. 3 news vans and a crowd of people with cameras. Dorothy's really shaken up. I'm coming over." "I don't think that's a good idea. Your showing up will just make things worse. The story's already being picked up by other outlets." Marcus closed his laptop and began dressing quickly, his mind racing through possibilities and damage control strategies. But every scenario he considered led to the same conclusion. Any public response from him would only feed the narrative that Torres had created. His phone continued ringing throughout the drive to the community center. Morrison, board members, his publicist, reporters wanting statements. Marcus ignored them all, focused only on reaching Keisha and Dorothy before the media circus destroyed what remained of their privacy. The scene outside the Garfield Community Center was everything Denise had warned him about, and worse. News vans lined the street, reporters clustered around the entrance, and a growing crowd of onlookers had gathered to witness what one television reporter was breathlessly describing as the unfolding story of alleged exploitation of Chicago's homeless population. Marcus parked 3 blocks away and approached through the alley behind the building, slipping through a back entrance that Denise had left unlocked for him. Inside, the usual bustling activity of the community center had been replaced by tense, quiet. Volunteers huddled in small groups, speaking in whispers. The computer lab was empty and the children's programs had been suspended. He found Dorothy and Keisha in Denise's office, Dorothy sitting with her arms protectively around her granddaughter, while Keisha clutched her worn notebook like a shield. Both looked overwhelmed and frightened by the sudden media attention that had transformed their private struggles into public spectacle. "I'm sorry," Marcus said immediately. "I never wanted this to happen." Dorothy looked up at him with tired. "Of what they're saying in that newspaper, is any of it true?" "No, none of it." "Then why are they saying it?" Marcus struggled for an answer that would make sense to a woman whose experience with media was limited to local news and newspaper stories about other people's problems. How could he explain the complex dynamics of corporate politics, investigative journalism, and public relations warfare to someone whose primary concerns were finding food and shelter? "Someone wanted to hurt me," he said simply, "and they're using you to do it. The reporters keep asking if you paid us to be your friends," Keisha said in a small voice. "They want to know if you gave us money to pretend to like you." The question broke Marcus's heart. "Keisha, you know that's not true." "I know," she said firmly, "but they don't believe me. They think I'm too little to understand what's really happening." Denise appeared in the doorway, her expression grim. "Marcus, it's getting worse out there. Channel 7 just ran a segment calling this the exploitation of Chicago's most vulnerable residents. And your business partners are already responding to media requests. What are they saying? That the board is reviewing the situation and considering appropriate measures to ensure corporate responsibility." Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. The investigative report had created exactly the narrative his business partners needed to justify removing him from leadership, not for his community involvement, but for the alleged poor judgment and public relations disasters that involvement had supposedly created. His phone buzzed with a text message from Morrison. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Your presence required." "What are you going to do?" Dorothy asked quietly. Marcus looked at the woman and child who had inadvertently become the center of a media storm designed to destroy his credibility and end his corporate career. They hadn't asked to become symbols in someone else's political warfare. They certainly hadn't deserved to have their private struggles weaponized against him. "I'm going to fight back," he said. "But that might mean more media attention, more reporters, more questions." "We can handle reporters," Dorothy said with quiet dignity. "What we can't handle is people thinking you helped us for bad reasons." "That's not fair to you, or to us," Keisha added. "Because if people think you're fake, then they might think we're fake too. And we're not fake." Over the next few hours, Marcus watched his carefully constructed world begin to collapse. Social media amplified Torres's article with the kind of viral intensity that transformed complex situations into simple narratives of good versus evil. Exploited family began trending, along with fake charity and just corporate manipulation. Business partners distanced themselves from him through carefully worded statements. Investors called emergency meetings. The Williams Technologies stock price dropped 12% in after-hours trading as speculation grew about potential leadership changes. But perhaps most damaging was the response from the community itself. Families Marcus had helped quietly began questioning his motives. Other volunteers at the community center looked at him with suspicion. The network of trust he'd spent months building threatened to collapse under the weight of media-created doubt. As evening approached and the reporters finally began dispersing, Marcus found himself alone with Keisha and Dorothy in the now quiet community center. The building felt different, less like the welcoming space it had become and more like a fortress under siege. "Are you going to stop helping people?" Keisha asked with the directness that had first caught his attention months ago. "What do you mean? The newspaper said you were helping people for bad reasons. So are you going to stop helping them now?" The question cut to the heart of everything Marcus had been wrestling with. The easiest path forward would be to retreat from community involvement, focus on repairing his business relationships, and let the media storm blow over. His corporate attorneys were probably already preparing statements that would distance him from the Johnson family while preserving his professional standing. "No," Marcus said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I'm not going to stop helping people, even if it costs you your business." Marcus thought about the photograph hidden in his desk drawer, about promises made to a dying grandmother, about the boy who had dreamed of lifting up everyone around him. "Especially if it costs me my business." Keisha smiled for the first time. "All day. Good, because I wrote a news story about you, and in my story you don't give up when things get hard." "What happens in your story?" "You fight back," she said simply, "and you win." Looking out at the city lights beyond the community center windows, Marcus realized that Keisha was right. He had to fight back, not just for his own reputation, but for the families he'd promised to help, for the community that had begun to trust him, and for the 8-year-old boy whose dreams had been interrupted, but not destroyed. The battle for his soul was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. The emergency board meeting lasted exactly 18 minutes, long enough for Marcus to present his resignation letter and not long enough for anyone to ask questions about his plans. Morrison accepted the document with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed his relief. And by noon, Marcus Williams was no longer the CEO of the company he'd built from nothing. The press release went out within the hour, carefully worded to suggest mutual agreement and strategic transitions, while avoiding any direct reference to the investigative article that had precipitated the crisis. Marcus read it on his phone while sitting in his now former parking space, marveling at how quickly a life's work could be reduced to corporate boilerplate. But instead of devastation, he felt something unexpected. a lightness that came from no longer carrying the weight of divided loyalties. For the first time in months, his priorities were perfectly clear. Within hours of his resignation, Marcus was back at the community center, working with Denise to organize what they began calling the Truth Campaign. If Janet Torres wanted to make his community involvement a public issue, then the public deserved to hear from the people who had actually been affected by his work. "We need documentation," Denise said, spreading papers across the conference room table. "Every family you've helped, every program you've supported, every volunteer hour you've contributed. We need a paper trail that shows what really happened." Here, the project that emerged over the next week was remarkable in its scope and intimacy. Families Marcus had helped quietly began coming forward with their stories. Not to reporters or media outlets, but to fill manila envelopes with handwritten testimonials that told the truth about his involvement in their lives. Mrs. Martinez wrote about the childcare program that had stayed open because of anonymous donors who appeared just when her liability insurance was about to lapse. Mr. Thompson described the tools and workspace that had transformed his informal car repair hobby into a legitimate business that now employed 3 neighbors. Ms. Washington detailed the tutoring materials and educational resources that had helped her help dozens of children improve their reading skills. Each letter was accompanied by documentation, receipts, photographs, before and after testimonials that painted a picture radically different from the one Janet Torres had constructed. Marcus found himself reading stories about his own actions that he'd forgotten or never fully understood the impact of. One letter particularly moved him, from a single mother named Carmen Rodriguez. "Mr. Williams probably doesn't remember me, but he paid for my son's emergency appendix surgery last month when we didn't have insurance. He never asked for publicity or recognition. In fact, he made sure the hospital kept it private so we wouldn't feel embarrassed. My son is alive today because someone cared enough to help without asking for anything in return." The letters kept coming. 43 families by the end of the first week, 68 by the end of the second. Each one told a story of quiet assistance, dignified help, and genuine human connection that contradicted every allegation in Torres's article. But organizing the Truth Campaign while dealing with the ongoing media circus proved exhausting. Reporters continued to stake out the community center, Dorothy and Keisha's temporary apartment, and even Marcus's penthouse building. The story had taken on a life of its own, with opinion pieces and cable news segments debating corporate responsibility and charity ethics without bothering to interview anyone who had actually witnessed Marcus's community involvement. It was during the second week of preparation that Dorothy's health took a dramatic turn for the worse. Marcus received the call. At 3 in the morning, Dorothy had collapsed at home and been rushed to Chicago General with severe respiratory distress. By the time he reached the hospital, she was unconscious and connected to machines that monitored every struggling breath. "The pneumonia came back," Dr. Patel explained quietly, "but this time it's complicated by congestive heart failure. Her body is tired, Mr. Williams, very tired." Keisha sat beside her grandmother's bed with a composure that broke Marcus's heart. At 8 years old, she'd already experienced more loss than many adults, and now faced the possibility of losing the only stable presence in her young life. Is she going to die?" Keisha asked with the directness that had first caught Marcus's attention months earlier. Dr. Patel's pause answered the question before his words did. "We're doing everything we can to make her comfortable." Dorothy lingered for 5 days, occasionally surfacing to consciousness long enough to squeeze Keisha's hand or whisper instructions about things that mattered to her, where she kept important papers, which neighbors to trust, how to find the savings account she'd hidden for emergencies. Marcus spent those 5 days learning to be the father figure he'd never expected to become. helping Keisha navigate hospital routines while trying to process his own grief over losing the woman who had become both friend and teacher in their brief but profound relationship. On the morning of the 5th day, Dorothy opened her eyes last time and looked directly at Marcus. "Take care of my baby," she whispered. "She's got dreams that deserve to come true. I promise." "And Marcus?" Her voice was barely audible. "Don't let them make you small again. You remember who you really are." Dorothy Mae Johnson died at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by the community she'd served and loved throughout her difficult but dignified life. The funeral 3 days later filled Mount Calvary Baptist Church beyond capacity, with mourners spilling onto the sidewalk and into the street beyond. Marcus had expected a small private service. What he discovered was a celebration of a woman whose influence had touched hundreds of lives through decades of quiet service. Dorothy had been a pillar of her community in ways that had nothing to do with wealth or recognition. She was the woman neighbors called when children needed watching, when elderly residents needed someone to check on them, when families needed someone to witness their joys and sorrows. The eulogy, delivered by Reverend Thomas Washington, painted a picture of Dorothy as someone who had understood that true wealth came from relationships and service rather than material accumulation. As Marcus listened to the pastor's words, he realized he was hearing his own eulogy as well, a description of the kind of man he hoped to become rather than the one he had been. Dorothy Johnson knew that helping people wasn't about getting credit. Reverend Washington said, "It was about seeing need and responding with love. She never asked if someone deserved help. She just helped." That's the legacy she leaves behind, and that's the challenge she gives to all of us. After the service, something unexpected happened. The crowd of mourners didn't disperse. Instead, they gathered outside the church for what became an impromptu community meeting. People began sharing stories about Dorothy, but also about the changes they'd seen in their neighborhood over the past few months. Mrs. Martinez spoke about the community center programs that had expanded. Mr. Thompson described new job opportunities that had emerged. Young mothers talked about educational resources that had appeared just when their children needed them most. As they spoke, a pattern emerged. A recognition that someone had been working quietly behind the scenes to strengthen their community in ways that went far beyond individual charity. "We know who's been helping us," Mrs. Martinez said, looking directly at Marcus. "And we know why that newspaper tried to make it sound dirty. Because when powerful people help regular people, it makes other powerful people uncomfortable." The crowd murmured agreement, and Marcus found himself at the center of something he'd never expected, a community rallying to defend him against the attacks that had cost him his business empire. "We need to tell our stories," said Reverend Washington. "The real stories, not the lies they're printing in newspapers. This man lost his job trying to help us. The least we can do is stand up and tell the truth about what he's actually done." That evening, back at the community center, Marcus sat surrounded by boxes of testimonial letters and documentary evidence that contradicted every aspect of Janet Torres's investigative report. The truth was all there, carefully documented and powerfully personal, but he wasn't sure it would be enough to overcome the narrative that had already taken root in the public consciousness. "You look worried," Keisha said, settling beside him with her notebook. Since Dorothy's death, she'd been staying with Mrs. Martinez while social services worked out longer-term arrangements for her care. "I am worried." "About what?" "About whether anyone will believe us. The truth doesn't always win just because it's true." Keisha opened her notebook to a page filled with her careful handwriting. "I wrote something for you. Want to hear it?" Marcus nodded, and Keisha began to read. "Once there was a man who forgot he was magic, but then he remembered and used his magic to help everyone in his neighborhood. But some bad people got jealous and tried to make everyone think his magic was fake. So all the people he'd helped got together and told everyone the truth about his magic. And then the man realized he'd been magic all along. not because of his money, but because of his heart. "How does the story end?" Marcus asked. "With everyone living happily ever after," Keisha said simply, "because that's what happens when people tell the truth and stick together." Looking around at the community center where he'd learned to remember who he really was, Marcus felt something Dorothy's death had threatened to extinguish: hope. Not just for vindication against false accusations, but for the possibility that truth and community could triumph over cynicism and manipulation. The hearing that would determine his future was scheduled for the following Monday. Marcus had resigned from his company, lost his business empire, and spent a fortune fighting for his reputation. But as he read through the testimonial letters one more time, he realized he'd gained something more valuable: a community that would fight for him. The way he'd learned to fight for them, Dorothy's challenge echoed in his memory. "Don't let them make you small again. You remember who you really are?" He remembered. And on Monday, the whole city would remember with him. The Chicago Ethics Commission had never seen anything like it. What was supposed to be a routine hearing about corporate conduct and charitable giving had transformed into a media spectacle that drew reporters from 3 states and filled the downtown municipal building beyond capacity. Every seat in the hearing room was occupied, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. Marcus sat at the respondents' table, flanked by attorneys who specialized in corporate ethics and public reputation management. Across the room, Janet Torres occupied the front row of press seating, her notebook ready to document what she'd already framed as the culmination of her investigative exposé. Commissioner Elena Vasquez called the hearing to order with a gravity that suggested the proceedings would determine more than just one man's reputation. "We're here to examine allegations of improper conduct in charitable giving and to determine whether Mr. Marcus Williams used his position and resources inappropriately in his interactions with vulnerable community members." The morning began with testimony from Marcus's former business associates, each painting a picture of a man whose judgment had become compromised by misguided priorities. Morrison spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed his statements multiple times. "Mr. Williams began displaying erratic behavior approximately 3 months ago," he testified. "Missing important meetings, making questionable financial decisions, proposing business strategies that had no basis in sound economic analysis." When the board rejected his $12 million community investment proposal, he became increasingly obsessed with what appeared to be publicity-seeking charitable activities. Patricia Chen's testimony was even more damaging. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention: highly visible charitable giving, strategic placement in sympathetic media stories, cultivation of relationships with photogenic beneficiaries. It had all the hallmarks of a calculated public relations campaign designed to pressure the board into reconsidering his rejected proposal. Each testimony built on Torres's original narrative: Marcus as a manipulative executive who had exploited vulnerable people for personal and professional gain. The commissioners listened with expressions that suggested they found the accusations credible and troubling. Marcus's attorney mounted a methodical defense, presenting financial records that showed his charitable giving had been genuinely anonymous. Timeline analysis that demonstrated his community involvement had preceded any media attention, and character witnesses who testified to his integrity and genuine compassion. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. During the lunch break, Marcus noticed a crowd gathering outside the municipal building. Community members had been arriving throughout the morning. Families from the neighborhood where he'd learned to remember his roots, volunteers from the community center, children from the educational programs he'd supported. They carried handmade signs with simple messages: truth, justice, and "we know who he really is." When the afternoon session resumed, Commissioner Vasquez announced that the hearing would include testimony from community members who had been directly affected by the actions under investigation. We believe it's important to hear from the people who were actually involved in these interactions. The first community witness was Mrs. Martinez, who spoke with quiet dignity about the childcare program that had stayed open because of Marcus's support. Her testimony was followed by Mr. Thompson, who described how anonymous assistance had transformed his automotive repair hobby into a legitimate business that now employed 3 neighbors. But it was when Keisha took the witness stand that the entire atmosphere of the hearing shifted. At 8 years old, she was the youngest person ever to testify before the Ethics Commission. She clutched a piece of paper covered with her careful handwriting, notes she'd prepared with Mrs. Martinez's help, words she'd chosen to tell her truth about the man who had become the closest thing to a father she'd ever known. "My name is Keisha Johnson," she began, her voice clear despite her obvious nervousness. "I want to tell you about Mr. Marcus because the newspaper said things about him that aren't true." Commissioner Vasquez leaned forward with the expression of someone trying to balance legal procedure with common human decency. "Keisha, you understand that you're here to tell us what really happened between you and Mr. Williams?" "Yes, ma'am. And what really happened is that he saved my life." The hearing room fell silent as Keisha consulted her notes and began to speak with a composure that belied her young age. 3 months ago, me and my grandmama were living in our car. We were hungry all the time and scared, and we didn't know what was going to happen to us. I went to Mr. Marcus's building because I thought maybe someone there would help us get food. She paused, looking directly at Marcus with a smile that conveyed more trust than any adult testimony could have managed. Mr. Marcus didn't have to stop and talk to me. He was wearing a fancy suit and carrying important papers, and I was just a little girl asking for help. But he stopped, and he listened, and he made me feel like my words mattered. Keisha's voice grew stronger as she continued. The newspaper said he helped us so people would take pictures and write nice stories about him. But that's not true. He made sure nobody took pictures of us. He made sure the doctors couldn't tell anyone when they helped my grandmama. He made sure I didn't feel embarrassed about needing help. She consulted her notes again, then looked up at the commissioners. With eyes that held wisdom beyond her years, "Mr. Marcus taught me that helping people isn't about getting credit for being nice. It's about seeing when someone needs help and helping them, because that's what good people do. He never asked me to say nice things about him. He never told me to talk to reporters. He just helped us because we needed help." The emotion in her voice broke through as she reached the most difficult part of her testimony. "When my grandmama was dying, Mr. Marcus sat in the hospital with us for 5 whole days. He didn't go to work. He didn't answer his phone calls. He just stayed with us because he knew I was scared and I didn't want to be alone. That's not something someone does for publicity. That's something someone does because they love you." Keisha wiped her eyes but continued speaking, her voice unwavering despite her tears. "My grandmama told me before she died that Mr. Marcus was the kind of person she'd been praying I would meet my whole life. Someone who would help me remember that the world has good people in it, even when bad things happen. The newspaper lady doesn't know him like I know him. She doesn't know that he reads stories with me every week, or that he helps me with my homework, or that he promised my grandmama he'd make sure my dreams come true." The hearing room remained completely silent as Keisha folded her notes and looked directly at Janet Torres. "I don't know why you wrote mean things about Mr. Marcus. Maybe you don't understand what it feels like when someone helps you and doesn't ask for anything back. But I know what it feels like. And I know the difference between someone who's pretending to be nice and someone who's really nice." She turned back to the commissioners for her final words. "Mr. Marcus isn't perfect, but he's good, and he's real. And when I grow up and become successful like him, I'm going to help people the same way he helped me." Because that's what you do when someone shows you how to be better than you thought you could be. As Keisha returned to her seat, Marcus could see that everything had changed. The commissioners were no longer listening to allegations. They were witnessing truth spoken with the kind of moral clarity that only comes from lived experience. In the press section, Janet Torres had stopped taking notes. Several reporters were wiping their eyes. The overflow crowd outside had grown quiet, listening to Keisha's testimony through the building's audio system. For the first time since this ordeal began, Marcus allowed himself to hope that the truth might actually be enough. The afternoon session resumed with Marcus's attorney presenting what he described as conclusive evidence of Mr. Williams's long-standing commitment to community service, a commitment that predates any business interests or public recognition by several decades. From his briefcase, the attorney withdrew a manila folder containing documents that Marcus hadn't looked at in years. At the top was a small envelope, yellowed with age, and bearing the careful handwriting of an 8-year-old boy. This letter was written by Marcus Williams in 1995, when he was 8 years old, the attorney announced. It was discovered in his grandmother's papers after her death and has been kept in Mr. Williams's personal files ever since. Marcus watched as Commissioner Vasquez carefully opened the envelope and removed a piece of notebook paper covered in childish handwriting. The words were faded, but still legible, and as she read them aloud, Marcus felt himself transported back to the boy who had written them with such earnest determination. Dear God, my name is Marcus Williams, and I live at 1247 South State Street with my grandmama. We don't have very much money and sometimes we get hungry. But grandmama says if I work really hard in school and never give up, someday I might be successful and have enough money to help other people too. I promise that if I ever get rich, I will come back and help all the kids in my neighborhood who are hungry like me. I will make sure they have food and a safe place to live, and someone who believes they can be successful too. I promise this. On my grandmama's Bible, your friend Marcus Williams, age 8. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus could see understanding dawn on the faces of the commissioners as they realized they were looking at the authentic motivation behind everything he'd done. Not a calculated public relations strategy, but a promise made by a child to his dying grandmother and to a God he hoped was listening. Mr. Williams, Commissioner Vasquez said softly, would you like to tell us about this letter? Marcus stood slowly, his legs unsteady as he approached the witness stand. For 30 years, he'd carried the weight of that childhood promise, sometimes forgetting it in the pursuit of success, but never able to completely escape its pull on his conscience. I wrote that letter after my grandmother made me promise that if I ever escaped poverty, I wouldn't forget the people still trapped in it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She was dying of cancer, working 3 jobs to keep us housed and fed, and she was terrified that I'd grow up and become someone who looked down on where I came from. He paused, looking out at the packed hearing room where faces reflected his own journey from poverty to success and back to purpose. For a long time, I convinced myself that my individual success was enough, that by becoming wealthy, I'd somehow honored her memory. But meeting Keisha reminded me that success without service is just selfishness with better clothes. Marcus's testimony continued for 20 minutes, describing his rediscovery of community, his growing understanding of systemic barriers to opportunity, and his realization that true wealth came from lifting others up alongside your own ascent. Didn't help Keisha and Dorothy for publicity, he concluded. I helped them because 8-year-old Marcus Williams had made a promise, and it took 30 years and a brave little girl to remind me that some promises are too important to break. The community testimony that followed painted a comprehensive picture of Marcus's impact that went far beyond individual charity. Carmen Rodriguez spoke about her son's life-saving surgery. The Hendersons described the educational resources that had transformed their daughter's academic prospects. Father Murphy from St. Augustine's detailed the youth programs that had been quietly funded through anonymous donations. As witness after witness shared their stories, a pattern emerged that contradicted every aspect of Janet Torres's original article. Marcus's help had been private, dignified, and consistently focused on empowerment rather than dependency. He'd created opportunities for people to improve their own circumstances rather than simply providing temporary relief. But perhaps the most dramatic moment came when Commissioner Martinez announced that the Ethics Commission had conducted its own investigation into the accuracy of the Tribune article that had triggered the hearing. Our review of Ms. Torres's sources and methodology has raised serious questions about the journalistic integrity of her investigation, Commissioner Martinez stated. Several of the anonymous sources cited in her article have since recanted their statements, admitting they had no direct knowledge of Mr. Williams's activities and were speculating based on rumors and assumptions. The revelation sent shockwaves through the hearing room. Torres's credibility, and by extension her article's credibility, crumbled as commissioners detailed the factual errors, unsupported allegations, and ethical lapses that had characterized her investigation. Furthermore, Commissioner Martinez continued, "Our examination of Williams Technologies board minutes reveals that Mr. Williams's community involvement began months before any business conflicts arose, contradicting the timeline suggested in Ms. Torres's reporting." As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the hearing had transformed from an investigation of Marcus's conduct into an examination of how fear and cynicism had nearly destroyed a man whose only crime had been taking his childhood promises seriously. The final testimony came from an unexpected source, Morrison, who had returned to the hearing room looking shaken and remorseful. "I'd like to revise my earlier testimony," he said, his voice barely audible. "After hearing the evidence presented today, I realized that my judgment of Mr. Williams was clouded by business disagreements and professional jealousy. His community involvement wasn't erratic behavior. It was the most consistent and admirable thing he'd ever done. Williams Technologies is less without him, and I regret the role I played in forcing his resignation." Commissioner Vasquez's ruling was unanimous and unequivocal. The Ethics Commission finds no evidence of improper conduct by Mr. Marcus Williams. On the contrary, the evidence suggests that Mr. Williams has conducted himself with exceptional integrity and genuine compassion in all his community activities. This case should serve as a reminder that in our cynical age, we must be careful not to destroy good people simply because their goodness challenges our assumptions about human nature. The celebration that erupted outside the municipal building was unlike anything downtown Chicago had seen in years. Community members who had traveled from across the city to support Marcus filled the streets, their handmade signs now joined by supporters who had followed the hearing through social media and news coverage. Children from the community center performed songs they'd written about second chances and keeping promises. Mrs. Martinez led a group of mothers in a prayer of thanksgiving. Mr. Thompson organized neighbors in impromptu testimony about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept that poverty and inequality are inevitable. As Marcus emerged from the building, Keisha ran to him and threw her arms around his waist. "I told you the story would have a happy ending," she said, grinning up at him with the satisfaction of someone whose faith had been vindicated. "You were right," Marcus replied. "You were right about everything." Looking out at the celebration surrounding him, at faces that reflected hope restored and community strengthened, Marcus realized that the boy who had written that letter 30 years ago had finally kept his promise. Not just to help people escape poverty, but to prove that success and service weren't contradictory goals. They were the same dream, written in different words. 6 months after the ethics hearing, Marcus stood in the same spot outside the Willis. tower, where Keisha had first approached him with 4 devastating words. The building looked the same, gleaming glass and steel reaching toward clouds that promised either storms or sunshine depending on the wind. But everything else had changed in ways that would have been impossible to imagine during those first desperate moments, when a hungry child had shattered his carefully constructed isolation. The bronze plaque beside the building's entrance was new, installed just that morning with a ceremony that had drawn community leaders, city officials, and the same reporters who had once questioned Marcus's motives. It read simply, Dorothy Mae Johnson Community Foundation, serving Chicago's families since 2025. True wealth comes from lifting others up alongside your own ascent. Keisha, now 9 and thriving in her 2nd year at Lincoln Elementary, traced the letters of her grandmother's name with careful reverence. She'd grown taller, more confident, her vocabulary expanded by exposure to books and ideas that had once seemed beyond reach. But her essential character remained unchanged. The curiosity, the wisdom, the capacity for hope that had first caught Marcus's attention. Grandmama would have liked seeing her name up there, she said, then looked up at Marcus with a smile that contained traces of mischief, but she would have scolded you for making the letters so fancy. Marcus laughed, remembering Dorothy's practical wisdom and her suspicion of anything that seemed designed more for show than for substance. She would have preferred the money go to programs instead of plaques. That's why we made it small. Keisha replied with the matter-of-fact logic that had become her trademark. And besides, the programs are huge now. Indeed they were. The Dorothy Mae Johnson Community Foundation had become one of Chicago's most innovative approaches to community development, combining Marcus's business expertise with deep community knowledge and authentic relationships built over months of patient listening. Unlike traditional charitable organizations that provided services to communities, the foundation worked with communities to identify their own priorities and develop their own solutions. The computer lab at the Garfield Community Center now boasted state-of-the-art equipment and served over 200 people monthly in digital literacy programs that had evolved into job training pipelines for technology careers. Mrs. Martinez's childcare program had expanded to serve 75 children with professionally trained staff and resources that met every family's needs regardless of their ability to pay. Mr. Thompson's automotive repair service had become a full-scale training center where young adults learned marketable skills while providing affordable car maintenance to their neighbors. But the foundation's most innovative program was its Proximity Mentorship Initiative. Successful professionals who committed to spending significant time in the communities they wanted to help, learning before leading, listening before advising. The program had attracted executives from across Chicago, creating a model that other cities were beginning to replicate. Mr. Marcus, Keisha said, consulting the digital tablet that had replaced her worn notebook as her constant companion, we need to get to the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Mrs. Rodriguez says the mayor will be there in 20 minutes. The ceremony they were attending marked the opening of the foundation's newest project, an educational center that provided after-school tutoring, college preparation, and career counseling in the heart of the South Side neighborhood where Marcus had grown up. The building itself was a restored community center that had been abandoned for 15 years, transformed through a combination of foundation funding, community volunteering, and city resources into a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept that some neighborhoods were destined for decline. As they walked through streets that had shaped both their characters, Marcus reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken. Losing his corporate empire had felt like catastrophe at the time, but it had freed him to pursue work that actually mattered. The foundation provided him with more genuine satisfaction than any quarterly profit report had ever delivered, and his days were filled with the kind of purpose that made sleep come easily and morning arrive with anticipation rather than dread. The professional consequences of his choices had been mixed, but ultimately positive. Several former Williams Technologies executives had joined the foundation, bringing corporate expertise to community development work. Other business leaders, inspired by Marcus's example, had begun their own proximity mentorship programs. Even Morrison had quietly contributed significant funding to the foundation's operations, his way of apologizing for doubts that had nearly destroyed something beautiful. Janet Torres, whose investigative article had triggered the crisis that changed everything, had written a follow-up piece 6 months later that acknowledged her errors and examined how cynicism about human motivation could blind journalists to genuine goodness. Her subsequent reporting had focused on successful community development programs across the Midwest, and she'd become an unexpected advocate for the foundation's approach to grassroots empowerment. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew over 300 people to the new educational center, including families who would use its services, volunteers who would staff its programs, and supporters who had learned that authentic community development required long-term commitment rather than short-term charity. Mayor Johnson spoke about Chicago's obligation to ensure that every child had access to educational opportunities regardless of their neighborhood or family income. But the day's most moving speech came from Keisha herself, now confident enough to address large crowds and articulate enough to inspire adults who had lived decades longer than her 9 years. "My grandmama used to tell me that education was the only thing nobody could take away from you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. But she never got to see what happens when a whole community decides to make education available to everyone. This center isn't just about tutoring or homework help. It's about making sure every kid in this neighborhood knows they have people who believe in them and want to help them succeed. She paused, looking out at faces that reflected the diversity and determination that had always characterized their community. "Mr. Marcus taught me that helping people isn't about being nice to them sometimes. It's about changing the systems that make their lives harder than they need to be. And today, we're changing one of those systems. We're saying that where you're born doesn't have to determine how far you can go." As the ceremony concluded and families began exploring the center's resources, Marcus found himself in conversation with a young businessman who had recently joined the foundation's mentorship program. "How do you measure success in this kind of work?" the young man asked. "In business, you have clear metrics: profit, growth, market share. But how do you know if you're making a real difference?" Marcus thought about the question, remembering when he had struggled with the same uncertainty. "You measure it in dreams that become plans," he said finally. "In children who start asking, 'How do I?' instead of 'What if?' In communities that begin believing in their own power to create change." He gestured toward Keisha, who was enthusiastically explaining the center's college preparation program to a group of middle school students. "When I met Keisha, she was writing stories about magical kingdoms where hungry children got fed. Now she's writing college application essays and business plans for programs she wants to start when she grows up. That's how you measure success, in the distance between dreams and plans." As the sun began to set over Chicago, Marcus and Keisha walked back toward the Willis Tower, past neighborhoods that had begun to show signs of the kind of organic improvement that came from residents who believed in their own capacity for change. New businesses opened by local entrepreneurs, community gardens tended by neighbors who had learned to see vacant lots as opportunities rather than eyesores. Children playing in streets that felt safer because adults had become invested in their collective well-being. "What are you going to write about tonight?" Marcus asked, knowing that Keisha still maintained her daily writing practice despite her increasingly busy schedule. "I'm writing about circles," she said thoughtfully, "about how sometimes you have to go all the way around something to understand where you started." "What kind of circles?" the circle that brought you back to the neighborhood where you grew up, the circle that brought me to you when I needed help, and now brings other kids to us when they need help. The circle that turns dreams into plans, into reality, and then back into new dreams. As they reached the Willis Tower, Marcus looked up at the windows that had once represented the pinnacle of his ambitions. Success from that height had felt like separation, him against the world, winner versus losers, individual achievement measured by distance from origins rather than service to community. Now, success felt like connection, not escape from his roots, but the capacity to help others grow their own, not individual wealth, but collective prosperity, not separation from community, but the privilege of helping community realize its own potential. The photograph in his desk drawer, the one that had reminded him of promises made and dreams deferred, now hung prominently in the foundation's offices, not hidden away as a source of shame, but displayed as a reminder that every successful person had once been someone else's hope for the future. Keisha squeezed his hand as they stood together in the spot where their story had begun. "Do you think we kept your promise?" she asked. "We kept it," Marcus replied, "and we'll keep making it new every day." Above them, the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, each window representing someone's dreams, someone's struggles, someone's possibility for transformation. And somewhere in those lights, Marcus knew, was the next child who would change everything simply by asking for help. The next adult who would remember that true wealth comes not from what you accumulate, but from what you give back. The circle was complete, and it was just beginning.